Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's event titled Turkey's Political Opposition. It's a great pleasure to have you here. My name is Sinan. I am the Executive Director of the Institute of Turkish Studies, which is based here at Georgetown. So let me just grab my notes, because I do have a few things to say. So the background to this talk is basically related to Berk and my ongoing research into this field regarding the Republican People's Party, which is Turkey's main opposition party and also the founding party of the Turkish Republic, going all the way back to 1923. Although this is not the first political party to be founded in the Ottoman Empire, it certainly is the first modern political party to be founded within the Republic of Turkey. So it is the oldest party. It is a state-founding party, the establisher of Turkey's political status quo, and all the trappings and traditions that go with that. So the reason why we decided to concentrate on this, because as you are well aware, this is a town which is very much focused on Turkey as a foreign policy actor and the implications of Turkey's foreign policy, either with the United States or the wider region. But nevertheless, there has been a healthy and growing interest in Turkey's domestic politics, particularly the main opposition parties within the Turkish parliament, not least of all the Republican People's Party. And to just put it in the context, Berk will speak a lot more about this, the Republican People's Party has been the main opposition party since the ascendancy of the current and incumbent Justice and Development Party led by Recep Tayyip Erdogan back in 2002. And since 2002, the party has experienced one leadership change and a significant number of other changes. And I'll stop there on the content of this course. So what we will do is Berk will take over over the podium in a second and go into the majority of the analysis of our research question, and I will then take over and hopefully engage in a little bit of number crunching towards the end. Which is not my forte, but nevertheless that is the task I've been handed. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Mr. Berk Esen, who is currently a PhD candidate at Cornell University in New York. And just to give you a little bit of a brief background on him, he has his bachelor's from Vanderbilt University in 2004, where he completed a triple major in social sciences, including political science and economics, which was followed on by 2 master's degrees, first of all in Sabancı University, and then Bremen Jacobs University in integrated social sciences. And then he returned back to the United States to take on a very prestigious position of fellowship at Cornell. He is a student of political science, studying comparative modernization with 4 cases, which is, as I might say, I might add, a significant challenge, but nevertheless one which we look forward to reading. So without much further input from me, I'll pass over the podium to my colleague.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much, Mr. Ciddi, for this nice introduction. And if you guys don't mind, I'm not going to use the microphone because I actually have like an automatic ingrained microphone. So if I were to mix them both up, it's going to be difficult for you guys to stay in the room for more than 10 minutes. So again, thanks so much for this nice introduction. It's truly a great pleasure to be speaking in front of you at Georgetown University at this event that is organized by the Institute of Turkish Studies. This is actually, we're not necessarily sort of working on the sort of you could say electoral studies. So this is something that we decided to take on because we don't really have that much. We don't really have that many studies that are coming out on Republican People's Party, despite the fact that it's actually the main opposition party in the Turkish political system, dating back for like decades. So anytime that you have a talk on Turkish politics in the city or elsewhere in other universities in the US, you generally get the sense that the Islamists are in power and they're running everything, and that's the only political party that you should know about. So we're trying to sort of change that, and this is our sort of first step. Basically, I'm not going to give you sort of a very long historical sort of overview of this party, but just by way of introduction, Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, as it is called in Turkish, or Republican People's Party in English, has been the oldest, as Sinan was saying, the oldest political party in the Turkish political system, and is also the most institutionalized political party. And this is rather interesting because in the developing world, you don't necessarily see political parties whose histories sort of go back, more than a decade or 2 decades. Whereas in the case of CHP, it was founded on 9th of September in 1923, but its roots go back to the Union and Progress Party, which has been established at the end of 19th century. Most of the analysis of this party tend to study CHP on its own, but we actually feel that there are several parties that resemble CHP in the Turkish context, and that, if one were to think about CHP, I think, we should put it on par with other state or system founding parties that we see in the developing world, such as the PRI of Mexico, which is still in power, or the India's Congress Party, again, a party that's in power, or the single party regime of Malaysia, or Taiwan's KMT. And the similarity between these parties is that they've all come out of either independence wars or big revolutions to institute the state and the political system. And over time, they have had various factions, which will be important for our story as well. In terms of the party's historical evolution, what is really remarkable about CHP is that even though it was established as an authoritarian nationalist political party that was that sort of established the state on the one side and tried to modernize the political system, over the decades it has changed, and it has changed quite dramatically. So we have an authoritarian single-party era that some of you might be familiar about, that goes back to 1923, which is the founding year of the Turkish Republic, until 1946, when the multi-party elections were introduced by actually the chairman of CHP, who was at the time the president of the Turkish Republic. So we have a multi-party period when CHP tried to liberalize, if not completely democratize, its internal organization from 1946 till 1960, and then after the military coup of 1960, from 61 to 65. And then we have the left of center sort of initiative that grew within CHP from 1965 till 1975. And with the election of Bülent Ecevit, who was the former prime minister of the Turkish Republic, you have the democratic left, sort of, as you can see if you were to trace CHP's history. CHP sort of transforming itself from an authoritarian state-building party towards a more social-democratic lines, and then we get to the social-democratic era of the post-1983. What is really remarkable about CHP, looking at this history, is that it is both responsible for the radical socioeconomic changes that occurred within the Turkish Republic over the last 80 years, and has in turn been shaped, transformed by those socioeconomic changes. And the research puzzle that we have, the sort of questions that we have been grappling with in our paper, and that is now the topic of today's talk and discussion, is that how come CHP, which, as I just briefly explained, has had a history of adaptability and ideological flexibility over the course of 5 or 6 decades, end up adopting such rigid, reactionary and nationalist policies under the Baykal years. This is the chairman of the political party of CHP from 1995 till 2010. And if that was the case, if CHP was so rigid, so unable to change, how come with the rise of Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who's the current chairman of CHP, this political party have begun to reform itself, have begun to adopt new political positions, have tried to establish a more competitive organization that could match, that could rival the ruling AKP. In a way, if, you would see that these two puzzles are sort of supplementary to each other, and that if you were to ask one of these questions, I think you should also ask the other one. And then, so these two questions I'll try to tackle, and then I'll leave the floor to my distinguished colleague, who's going to analyze what happened or what sort of results CHP has achieved in the 2011 election, which was the first election that CHP had under Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the new leader of the party. So basically, if you were to look at the Baykal years, what one sees is an unwillingness of the political party, or at least its leadership, to adopt the political platform of this party to suit or reflect the increasingly diversifying demands or elements of the Turkish voters. Because in the 1990s, the Turkish political system has changed dramatically with the rise of the Kurdish nationalist movement and the strengthening, at least at the electoral level, if not at the organization level, of political Islam, of the Islamist movement. And CHP had failed to address these two questions and have become more and more reactionary, sort of living off the fears of the urban voters, the urban secular voters who have been living in the metropolitan areas of Turkey and who have classified themselves as Kemalists. Voting for different parties, but that they were pro-status quo, supporting the political system. So CHP, under the command of Deniz Baykal, could not really reach out to its leftist, more social democratic, more populist, or more inclusionary elements or traditions of CHP, and instead adopted a much more rigid political course. And any issue that you look at from the 1990s or the 2000s, any position that CHP has taken has been much more pro-status quo and reactionary than CHP of the previous decades, such as its anti-EU discourse, its refusal to accept negotiation in the Cyprus question, the sort of illiberal position, illiberal or anti-democratic, depending on how you position yourself on these questions, positions that the party has taken on the Kurdish question and political Islam. And I think the Turkish political scientist İlter Turan has really, in one sentence, sort of captures the dilemma that CHP has faced over these years under Deniz Baykal. As Turan puts it, CHP had this inability to develop ideas and programs that were responsive, that could be responsive to the needs and the failure to appeal to the new constituencies, which have weakened its ties with the electorate. So what we saw during these years was a CHP becoming increasingly exclusionary and losing its electoral appeal with the voters, which basically produced a party that was controlled by a very narrow base group of activists who were really passionate, who were really Kemalists, who really loved the party but couldn't really expand its appeal. And that basically, by controlling these activists, by controlling these people, Baykal could keep his position and stay on as the chairman of this political party, despite the fact that CHP continuously lost elections from 1995 to 2010. And to any political scientist, this must be a very interesting sort of puzzle to ask, because, if you are a supporter of a political party and your leader is constantly weakened and keeps on losing elections, why do you support this guy? And why do you keep on voting for this political party? Or, you could say, was it actually rational for Deniz Baykal, for the chairman of CHP, to pursue such a strategy? And the way that we discussed this question in our paper is that there was actually a rationale behind the sort of positions that were taken by Deniz Baykal during these years. And that is, I think as a rational politician, Deniz Baykal has realized that because of the rapid socioeconomic changes that occurred within Turkish society, CHP, with its secular urban agenda, did not really have the chance to win elections, regardless of what it could do, regardless of what political agenda it could come up with. So instead of trying to compete with the Islamist or the Kurdish political parties on par, what Baykal's CHP did was to provide a political cover for what we consider to be veto players of the Turkish political system. And veto players, we basically use Sebelis's definition, which is that a veto player is an individual or a collective actor whose agreement is required for a change of the status quo. So Baykal's CHP could basically say, look, you know, I can lose this election, but there is still the constitutional court that could overturn a legislation that the Islamist party would pass in the political parliament. Or, you know, if the constitutional court path is not open, for some reason the constitutional court has not overturned it, or it's not an issue that could be taken to the constitutional court, you have the army. The generals behind the scenes could pressure the Islamist party to drop whatever issue that might be concerning to the CHP electorate, whether it be an anti-alcohol sort of legislation or any sort of a conservative legislation, any aspect of the conservative agenda could get overturned from the constitutional court, or could get overturned because of the pressure exerted by the military or the generals behind the scenes, or by Çankaya, which is the sort of colloquial term that you would use in Turkey to describe the president, because the presidential palace is located on a hill that is called Çankaya. And up until 2007, the presidents have all come from the secular segments of the Turkish political system. So in a way, CHP has become the political party that kept on losing elections, but could draw enough legitimacy to itself to offer political cover for these rather more anti-democratic sort of interventions that either of these veto players were exerting. And to give you a sense of the sort of relative weight that CHP has had, between 1995 and 2007, basically the last national election that CHP entered under Deniz Baykal, the vote share, the sheer vote share of the political party oscillated between 8.7%, which has been its lowest, and 21.9%, I believe. So it's really a very, very, I mean, not an extremely small minority of the Turkish electorate, but certainly not enough to join the government. And yet, CHP, because of the strategy, could actually have much more weight than it would have had Baykal pursued a more electoral sort of path. Now, this might not be something that a Democrat on paper could easily endorse, but from a rational sort of politician's perspective, if your purpose is to pursue your agenda, this was actually a rational way of doing it. And it worked up until basically the end of the 2000s. So what changed? What changed was actually, you could say, an exogenous shock in the form of a sex tape that came out that put Deniz Baykal in a very awkward position, because, you know, I'm not going to go too much into detail, although
we don't have a clip of it.
Although if I were to do that, I would probably be the most the rather more interesting part of this talk. But basically, as the sex tape revealed, Deniz Baykal was having an affair with his chief of staff of, I believe, 19 years when the cassette came out. So sort of an embarrassed Deniz Baykal had to resign and basically leave this position that he coveted for almost 2 decades, because Deniz Baykal has been a big name in Turkish center-left politics going all the way back to the 1970s, and he's been the chairman of CHP since 1993. Almost 2 decades of his leadership has been shattered. I will just make one very brief observation, and that is the increasingly strange nature of Turkish politics starting from 2009 and 2010, when these sex tapes have mysteriously began to come out, and these sex tapes that targeted major politicians from opposition parties. I'm not necessarily suggesting that the governing party is particularly responsible for the rise of these sex tapes, but to me, as a Turkish voter, if the government cannot take a position, cannot persecute, cannot even investigate, or have the courage to investigate sex tapes that target opposition politicians, then they should be held accountable. Because this is not the only example. We had 10 sex tapes that targeted members, very high-level members of the ultra-nationalist party, that just came out several weeks before the 2011 elections. And these people had to all resign. So this has become one way of redesigning the Turkish political system through, maybe not through the veto players, but this is also not a very democratic way of doing politics. So what basically happened was that this sex tape came out only 3 weeks before the National Convention of CHP, when everyone sort of assumed initially that Baykal would again become a nominee and would win the election unopposed. And what happened was that because he had to resign, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who was the candidate for the Istanbul mayoral elections in 2009, basically the most popular CHP politician at the time, was nominated almost in unanimity by different factions of the political party, which is really interesting because if you were to look at the history of CHP, you always end up with factional strifes. And it's only with the rise of Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu and his election as the chairman, there is unanimity. And the way that we interpreted this is that because there was a lot of unpredictability, because there was an unpredictable political environment, the different political factions, some of them were actually followers of Deniz Baykal or some others followers of Önder Sav, who at the time was the general secretary of the party, ended up saying, you know, look, rather than us nominating different candidates and end up dividing the party and then paying the price in the coming elections, which were going to come in basically 1 year, let us all get behind this very popular leader, have him get elected as the chairman, and then try to pick the positions around him. But what happened is that under Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, CHP has begun to change. And the thing that we are exploring is basically the gist of our paper, the main theme of our talk, is that how much of a change has actually occurred within the CHP and how we can actually measure it or how we can study it. The first observation that we would like to make is that the political change that has happened within CHP since 2010 has not been a product of the rise of an ideological faction, as has been the case during the 1960s or 70s, or a major socioeconomic change of the political base of this party, or even part of a grand strategy with a very clear roadmap. It was basically, it has started because of Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu and the few advisors that were sort of gathered around him to respond to the sort of criticisms that people have leveled against what you could call the old CHP. The sort of criticisms that we political scientists have been also writing about. Well, you know, maybe not me personally, but you know, if you were a bit older, you would have written those criticisms as well. So, you know, like the sort of discontent that leftist intellectuals had over the ultranationalist policies of CHP, its EU skepticism, its elitism, you know, its sort of exclusionary approach towards Muslims who make up basically the majority of the Turkish electorate, and its authoritarian political style and inability to engage with the urban poor, which is going to become an important theme for Sinan. And the way that we're analyzing the sort of changes that occurred within CHP is that we're sort of dividing them into three different sort of sections. One, the ideological changes that occurred. So, you know, what has changed ideologically speaking within CHP? And quite a lot. Because for the first time, for the 2011 campaign, after almost 2 decades, CHP has begun to act like a catch-all party. Maybe not succeeded, or at least this is something that we want to discuss, but at least in terms of its approach to politics, it has begun to say that it should be able to compete with AKP to win elections. And the way that this has been done is to transform CHP into a catch-all party that has been sort of captured with the slogan, with the election slogan, CHP for everyone. So CHP trying to target messages for each socioeconomic or national group within the Turkish electorate. And we have witnessed a shift within CHP's long-standing sort of positions, or its long-standing sort of opposition towards certain key ideological issues as part of the identity wars of Turkish society from the 1990s, and that is the headscarf, whether or not women wearing headscarves should be allowed on university campuses or not, and of course the Kurdish question, which is right now the main political problem of the Turkish political system. So when we looked at the CHP's electoral agenda, and we've seen a laundry list of campaign promises that are sort of especially targeting small electoral groups, whether it be the lower gasoline prices and cheap credits for farmers, which is arguably not as big of an electoral group as it was 30 years ago, but they still make up around 25% of the electorate. Increased retirement benefits, reform of the mandatory military service, which is to us is an important issue. Extra scholarship for university students, and the very important family insurance scheme. And because we're sort of running out of time and we still have some material to go through, I will leave sort of a general discussion of these points for the Q&A session. If any of you are interested in any of these points, we'll be happy to elaborate. But what we also saw is that despite the fact that CHP has begun to come up with a new rhetoric, none of these proposals were clear. It was clear that there was no roadmap coming from the chairman or the people who were cooperating with the chairman Kılıçdaroğlu within CHP to draw up new positions. So what was, I think, in their mind important was to say that, okay, CHP is no longer opposed to some of these problems, some of these issues. What they did not really say was how CHP could solve some of these problems if it were to come to power. So as it will become a sort of a clear theme in our talk, any sort of radical change that CHP has begun over the last 2 years has been partial, as we see in the case of the ideological changes. So the partial change, and we see this very clearly in party ideology and the way that we interpret this. And there is actually other political scientists who looked at other ideological parties in other contexts, not necessarily just in Turkey, have come up with this argument, and I think this applies to CHP as well. And that is, party elites usually find it a lot easier to revise the sort of political elements that would allow them to maximize their votes in the elections. So, whether it be campaign strategy, marketing the candidates, picking a new group of candidates, or different style of candidate selection, or even the organizational structure. For these political parties, it's much easier to handle these aspects than to renew or reform the party ideology, which would come at the end of the list. And this is exactly what we see in the new CHP, is that it has begun to say new things, but the reform or the revision of the party ideology has been partial, and it will come at the end of the list. The other element that has changed is that, Deniz Baykal, for students or analysts of Turkish politics in this room, this would be a no-brainer. But Deniz Baykal was basically a very, very unpopular leader. I mean, even if you were to talk with the CHP voters from the 1990s and 2000s, the first thing that they would say is that I voted for CHP despite Deniz Baykal. So Deniz Baykal was not a leader who was popular or strong enough to bring in new voters for the party. And was even probably responsible for losing some old CHP voters. And with Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, this has begun to change, and this has begun to change quite radically, because This is a guy who has been a top-level civil servant, who's been the executive director of CCAS, which is like the Social Security Agency of Turkish politics. And if you're a politician in a center-left party, this is pretty much the highest you could get as far as state jobs go. He has a very clean record, despite the fact that he's been, working for the state for almost 3 decades. He has a very soft-spoken, non-polemical, almost unlike CHP politician style, but he's also very serious. And we have seen this since he became an MP in the year 2002. During the campaign, unlike Deniz Baykal, who usually ended up visiting the provinces where CHP usually gets a good result, Kılıçdaroğlu ended up visiting every single province of the Turkish Republic, 81 of them, surpassing the rather energetic Erdogan, who usually makes a habit of visiting at least 60 or 65 provinces in every election, despite the fact that his party is going to win the election overwhelmingly. Kılıçdaroğlu actually, for the first time, has surpassed that limit. And in general, he has sort of devised a very popular and a populist sort of discourse, being in favor of democracy overall, and also meeting up with different socioeconomic groups that have in the past not voted for CHP. So he was really trying to change the image of the party, and in doing so, I think he was rather, I mean, this is probably common, I shouldn't even say I think, it would be easy to say that he has been much more popular than Deniz Baykal, so that we see the leadership change very clearly. What is still up for discussion, at least for us when we were writing this paper, is that we still don't know how much of a personal base he has within the party. Basically, he got elected as the chairman of the party as a result of this exogenous shock. He has not been organizing sort of a faction within CHP. He has first gotten elected as an MP in 2002, so he actually doesn't have that much of a political experience, at least in comparison with other leaders, other chairmen of Turkish political parties who are much older, if not much older, much more experienced. So what we don't really know is that everyone seems to like Kılıçdaroğlu, but what we don't know is whether anyone would really follow him fully if he were to continue with the reform process within CHP. In other words, we actually don't know whether he has enough political capital if he were to tackle some of the critical problems of the Turkish political system, the most important being the Kurdish question. So if Kılıçdaroğlu were to go even further and say radical things in criticism with, in criticizing certain aspects of Kemalism, whether he'd be able to do that, and whether if he were to do that, he would have enough of a base to push for it. Because if CHP is going to change ideologically, the leader has to have some sort of strength, autonomy within the party pushing for it. And the other problem that we see is that Kılıçdaroğlu has come out, especially in the campaign, arguing or pretending to have new positions on some of these key issues, especially the headscarf issue. And yet, when the base of the party responded in a critical manner to some of his statements, he ended up reversing his positions. And the third and the last aspect that we look at in our paper is the organizational structuring that has occurred within CHP in 2010 and the renewal of the cadres. Because the problem for CHP, and I'm using this as a loose analogy, I'm not going to push it too much, but after Deniz Baykal resigned, CHP looked almost similar to what happens in an authoritarian country when the leader dies. No one knows what's going to come afterwards. Everyone is sort of concerned to keep their positions, and you don't have any credible people left around, who could actually come out and say, look, I can change the system, because everyone has been tainted by the authoritarian system. Well, this was very similar to the challenge as far as the CHP cadres are concerned, because everyone you could pick to join the Kılıçdaroğlu sort of faction have all worked for Deniz Baykal. So with what credibility could they say, now we're coming in place, on board, ready to change CHP? So what Kılıçdaroğlu did was he actually invited, and this was also a public campaign, he invited well-known intellectuals, journalists, professionals to join the party. human rights activists, lawyers, with some credibility in the public opinion, if not experience within the party, to join him. And actually some people came. I'm not going to talk about every single name, although in the Q&A session, if you guys are interested, we'll be happy to elaborate. But just give you a sense of it, Sencer Ayata has been a leftist academic working for ODTÜ, which is a prestigious public university in Turkey, sort of equivalent of Berkeley, you could say in the American context. Or Sezgin Tanrıkulu is, to me, and probably Sinan will join me in saying this, Sezgin Tanrıkulu has been the most surprising sort of transfer, because he has been a Kurdish lawyer, a human rights activist, who have fought for the Kurdish political movement, if not the nationalist movement, for decades, and has been very critical of the Turkish political system, as well as CHP, of course. And he is now, for the last 2 years, and kept this position for the last 2 years, he's been the deputy chairman of CHP, responsible for the democratization portfolio. This is remarkable as a change. You don't necessarily see it in the press, but this is a remarkable change. What is, again, going back to our theme about CHP changing, but the change is being a bit partial, is the sort of uneasy balance that you saw on the candidate list. Because, several people such as Nur Sertel, Sinan Aydın, who have represented who have defined the more nationalist, the more reactionary approach of CHP going back to the 1990s, have also been candidates. So, and in terms of the organizational structuring, the website has been renewed, the automatic membership due collection has been reformed, and this was very important for CHP, which is a party that is very short on resources. Sort of the membership structure has been opened for new people to come. The process has been simplified. And more importantly, at least for us, the primaries have been introduced. Because back in the day, Deniz Baykal, as the strong leader of the party, chose the MP candidates who then won the elections and then elected Baykal. So there was a sort of a vicious cycle. And this cycle, under Kılıçdaroğlu, has been broken, and it has been broken for good, because in 29 cities, primaries have been done, and the MP candidates of CHP, and CHP has been the only party to do so in 2011, have been elected by the CHP base, which is a very important sort of change. But, and again we have a but in our paper, the organizational strength of the party, as far as we could see from the 2011 elections, has been weak. Certain political appointments within the party have also been arbitrary, sort of like what would happen under Deniz Baykal. Factional fights continue. It is continued up until the election. The cadres are overall not very experienced, and the organizational structure, because of these factional fights, have been uprooted. Just to give you a sense of it, in Istanbul, which is the most important, the most populous city in the Turkish political context, the chairman of the local chairman of CHP in Istanbul has changed 4 times over the course of 14 months, leading up to the elections. So I'm about to wrap it up, just to give you a sense of what happened, what sort of results CHP has received in the 2000 elections. What we see clearly is that its vote share increased across the board, across the country, except for 15 provinces. 11 of them, not surprisingly, located in the Kurdish populated areas. So the CHP's Kurdish problem continues. In 20 provinces, which are mostly located in central Anatolia, inner parts of the Black Sea regions, which are basically heartland Anatolia, the small town sort of Turkey, who have been the sort of strongholds of the Islamist AKP. In 20 of these provinces, the vote increase has been marginal. And marginal, we define it as any increase beneath the 3% benchmark. However, in 38 provinces, the party has increased its votes from ranging 3 to 10%, and in some cases been a remarkable increase. The most important being Tunceli, which is Kılıçdaroğlu's hometown, with almost a 40% vote increase in just one election time. So we're comparing the CHP's election results from 2007 and 2011 elections. So only the parliamentary elections. Now maybe I should give you a sort of a map and act like a weatherman. if you were to look at the electoral map from the 2011 elections, the core support of CHP has been sort of divided into 5 clusters. The Teres or the Trakya region and the Aegean region, so these 2 areas. Or in general, like the coastlines, the more developed, the more western parts of the country. The major urban centers, such as Istanbul, Eskişehir, Ankara, maybe you could say Adana, Hatay. And then certain pockets of, you could say, social democratic resistance over the last 30 years, as center-right and now Islamist parties have been on the rise. Small clusters of provinces have continued to vote for elected parties. And in the Black Sea region, we see Zonguldak, it's a mining town. We see Sinop over here. And then Ardahan, and Artvin and Ardahan. So in these cities, CHP has also done relatively well. And then lastly, we have the Alevi axis. The Alevites being the religious minority in Turkey, have been historically supported CHP. But in this particular election, especially so because Kılıçdaroğlu himself is an Alevi. So it created, what is not exactly similar, but sort of what Barack Obama could do with the African Americans. African Americans always voted in large numbers for the Democrat Party, but their turnout seemed to have really skyrocketed in the 2008 presidential elections. A very similar thing happened with the Alevite voters and CHP. So Çorum, Amasya, and Tokat, their historical homeland, and then Tunceli, Malatya, and Erzincan. So these are basically the 5 clusters of CHP vote, And lastly, if you were to look at the electoral support of CHP region by region, Turkey has 7 regions. The biggest vote increase or swing has occurred in the Aegean, Marmara, and the Mediterranean regions. Again, the coastlines that are more developed western parts of the country. The Black Sea, I was talking about the small social democratic provinces, sort of also went up 5.3%, although the starting point was rather low, so this is not such a remarkable increase. And then in the heartland of Anatolia, the central Anatolia, the increase has been 3.9%. Not bad, but again, not very high. And in eastern Anatolia and southeastern Anatolia, where the majority of the Kurdish citizens live, the vote increase has been very dismal. 0.2% in southeastern Anatolia and 0.6% in eastern Anatolia. And just by way of wrapping up, to give you a sense of CHP's unbalanced sort of support across the board, out of 16 most populous provinces, in 14 of them, CHP has increased its votes. The 2 of them where CHP vote has gone down are Şanlıurfa and Van, 2 cities located in the eastern part. This is an overall map that shows the provinces where each party won. So these are CHP. CHP came out as the first party in the west. These are basically the Kurdish-dominated areas, which have overwhelmingly voted for the independence, and the rest of the country basically Islamist. So CHP, in a way, at least looking at the 2011 elections, continues to be not a national party, but a regional party whose support is basically concentrated on rather small but more developed, more populous parts of the country. And on that note, let me leave the floor to my distinguished colleague to give you a better sense of how CHP has done with the urban poor voters.
Okay, so I'm not going to take too much more of your time simply because this is number crunching, so maybe we could leave this up to Q&A sessions. But I will just go over some broad stroke or big brush strokes in terms of looking at some of the micro data, just in terms of giving you a sentence at a time to just let you have a sense of what we mean at a more local level. I think it's not an elephant in the room, but the big thing to note about this entire analysis is to suggest that the problem that bedevils the CHP as we speak, or as we look at the bigger picture, is to suggest that it is very much far behind the incumbent Justice and Development Party, or the AKP. The vote difference is approximately double across the nation. So in 2011, the overall national vote achieved by both parties was, the AKP approximated somewhere in the region of 50% of the total vote, and the CHP came in at 26%, or just under 25.9. So that gives you a sense of how big the distance is. So there is a lot of work to be done. What we are discussing in the paper, obviously, is, has there been change? Yes. Has there been meaningful and substantial change within the party? Its ideology, as well as the grassroots organization and the structural organization of the party? Yes. Has this had a big impact on Turkish voters that are predisposed to voting for the CHP or otherwise? The answer is yes. But the question then becomes, well, to what extent has there been an impact? And that is a lot more difficult to answer. Because if you ask the average Turkish voter, by which I mean, I think actually it's very much fair to say that if you want the best opinion of what's going on in Turkish politics, speak to a taxi driver. No kidding. One of the answers you're going to get is, well, why wasn't this? If you ask them questions, what's wrong with the CHP? Why aren't people voting more for the CHP? The answer, as Berk said, would be, well, it's Deniz Baykal. He was the most unpopular leader this party had. So that represents an agency problem to you. Well, we've had leadership change, we've had structural change and ideological change in numerous openings, which is very refreshing to see on many levels. How has that changed in terms of vote share? And the answer is not very much. Baykal's previous 2007 electoral results for the party was what, 22%? Right. Somewhere approximately 22% national vote. In 2011, under Kılıçdaroğlu, the party has achieved just below 26%. That's a vote change or increase of about 4%. So does that mean that that's an agency problem? I don't think so, or we don't think so. We may differ on this in nuances and stuff, but just the change of what's happened in the last 4 years, that's very different. And I'm not going to go through tables like, it's just, this is something to read in a paper, when you have not very much to do on a Saturday evening. What we did, this is following on from my initial study in 2007, when I looked at the 3 big cities of Turkey, Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir. And what I did in those is I selected 7 districts in each of the cities, which can be classified as low socioeconomic status, below certain income threshold, lower middle class, what we refer to as gecekondu in Turkish, or what you might approximately equate as shantytown, but it doesn't actually give the same connotation, because shantytowns are not built in with the notion of social mobility, whereas gecekondus have a higher element of social mobility linked into them. But nevertheless, these districts are supposed to be the breeding ground for political parties of a social democratic nature, as to, in the same way that the CHP describes itself. The CHP describes itself as the defender of the small man in Turkish society. So these should be districts in which a social democratic party representing the small man in society should be grabbing a lot of votes. Is that happening? Between 2007 to 2011, the answer is overall, no. The one that we have up here is Istanbul, just to give you a demonstration of this. In 2011, this table here represents what we call the political Islamist parties. And it's a time series of what the Islamist parties, but most notably the AKP, has gained since 1999. If you look at it, in 2011, in Zeytinburnu, for example, the AKP achieved 52% of the votes. In 1999, it was only 22%. Okay. Other places like Sultanbeyli, 69% of the vote versus 30% of the vote back in 1999. How does that compare to the Republican People's Party? In 2011, they only achieved less than half of what the AKP achieved, in 23%, and in Sultanbeyli, 9%. Now, there's more variance when you look at different districts, obviously, but the essential point that these tables point out is to suggest that the CHP has an immense way to go. It has a very hard time attracting the urban poor, or more, not just the urban poor, but as Berk described it, more differentiated niches of Turkish society. The best way to sort of sort of highlight that point is to suggest this. Now, I gave an interview to Zaman newspaper, which was slightly blown out of context and proportion, and to my credit, or this lack of credit, I didn't defend myself and reply to that article. We use the notion of electoral ghettoization, and that's not something that we pulled out of a hat, although the paper decided to make that into, saying the CHP is a ghetto party, which was just ridiculous, but never mind. Electoral ghettoization is a political science jargon term. I mean, we use it because it's actually what it represents. And the CHP's biggest problem is that its votes are ghettoized into particular parts of the country. The Kılıçdaroğlu administration has not been able to overturn this. And the important word here to use is yet. Right? Ghettoization means it is clustered and concentrated in predominantly the Aegean, maybe Mediterranean, and particularly the Thracian regions of the country. This is the gauntlet, this is the challenge that is faced by the CHP, and this is not an easy task, right? And the active word here that I've used is obviously yet. And whilst this is, all these provinces have been won by the AKP, and these are the only ones by the CHP. Don't forget, this is not an accurate picture. This is not the best way to look at it. Hence why we used, this map, which gives you a more fair representation of vote concentrations. The darker the color, the more votes have been gained by the CHP. So these are obviously the darkest regions. And these are regions where, the inner central Anatolian and eastern and southeastern Anatolian regions where the CHP has done less well, and which has been dominated by other political movements. Final points that we'll finish on, to give you some material to concentrate on. Kılıçdaroğlu has not had enough time. I mean, the exogenous shock under which he was elected has not given him enough time, obviously, between 2010 to 2011 to build a credible electoral platform that will change the mind of voters in a jiffy, so to speak. This is not, the AKP, the incumbent AKP has been in power since 2002, but the broader Islamist, political Islam movement, as represented by the AKP and previously the Welfare Party, has been in office since 1994. What I mean by that, not at the national level, but broadly at the provincial level, the political Islamist movement has had the opportunity of assuming provincial governments, municipality governments, and then eventually the national governments beginning in 2002. And as a result, it has been, the political Islamist movement has been in an opportune position to build a national agenda. If you're in charge of municipal governments, if you are in charge of provincial governments, and finally the national governmental level, this gives you a unique opportunity to dominate all levels of government. The CHP does not have that. And you can say, well, why is it in a position to do that? That's a fair question. But I'm just saying to you, in terms of the time that Kılıçdaroğlu has been in power and the circumstances under which he assumed power, there hasn't been enough time. The second point to conclusion to reach about this is to suggest, which is actually ironic, not ironic, sort of skew-iffed or just tipsy-turvy. We mentioned the concept of reliance on veto players. Under Baykal years, since 2002, the only meaningful opposition that the CHP put out against the incumbent governing party was to play upon the urban, secular and educated voters' fears, as opposed to representing broader niches of Turkish society, least of all the urban poor and pro-social democratic voters, or potential pro-social democratic voters. Reliance on the Constitutional Court, reliance on the office of the President, reliance on the military. Now, yes, these are undemocratic institutions to build a national coalition or an agenda, but one can argue reliance on those kept the CHP in a more prominent position to criticize government initiatives or to put out a national platform to oppose policies. Because it was saying to the electorate, I'm sorry, we're not in a position to oppose the government because we're not in a position of government. But we are going to use everything at our disposal to combat the AKP, and these are the tools we have again at our disposal. Now, Kılıçdaroğlu, as Berk mentioned, has distanced himself from that. Now, the political landscape hasn't changed. In fact, in 2011, the AKP's mandate for power has been renewed and strengthened. Non-reliance on veto players makes the CHP's job more difficult because they are not relying on previously, quote-unquote, undemocratic institutions with which to cause problems with the AKP. And that is no small problem. Okay. And lastly, I think what I want to end on is to suggest that all the changes initiated, structural changes by the Kılıçdaroğlu administration, such as the use of primary elections to determine candidates so that the party is more representative, not only determined candidate selection, but also rejuvenated and regenerated the provincial party organizations which were more representative and in line with the choice of the party membership. These provincial organizations, these new candidates, the biggest criticism, it's not a criticism, but it's just a reality, they are inexperienced. This is not a professional political machine as compared to the incumbent. The incumbent is a 24/7 professional political machine that has had the experience of incumbency and the resources of national government and the resources of the state institutions to help solidify, bolster and maintain their dominant position. Hence why political scientists right now are describing the current party system that Turkey is in as a dominant party system. And that's one of the natural consequences of that. So having a rejuvenated political party base and provincial organization, democratic representative of candidates, it's just not as well-oiled and as professional as its main opponent, its main rival. These things take time. And in the 2011 elections, we did see a major problem whereby the CHP provincial organizations were having problems canvassing voters. I mean, it was just problematic in the sense that whilst the AKP had, for example, really well-styled minibuses blurting out a message 24/7, the faithful voters that were, party sympathizers and campaigners that were going out with their selected, doors to knock on or TV appearances, whatever. What we saw in the CHP was a gross lack of that, simply because the party was not as well prepared for this. So, and the very last point is, you can sort of classify this as a chicken and the egg situation. How does the CHP get out of this? And the answer is, we don't know. The AKP has been in a position to not necessarily just demonstrate, 3 successive terms of office, but it is a position of being able to distribute what in American politics is referred to as pork, spoils to sympathizers. It's in a position to achieve tangible change and tangible policies such as increasing retired people's state subsidied salaries, or reinvent or restructure the health system so that people don't have to line up outside of hospitals to gain prescriptions but can just go to the local pharmacy. What I'm saying is the AKP is in a much more tangible position to maintain its incumbency as compared to the CHP, which has to demonstrate why it's more credible than the AKP, and that's not easy to achieve with a new leadership and a new organization, which was dominated previously by Deniz Baykal, which, as Berk said, was the most unpopular leader. So we'll stop there. We've taken up enough of your time in terms of us talking, and then invite you to ask questions. So Berk, if you come up here with me, we can field questions as much as people. But there we are, that's us. Thank you.
Yes, part of me would like to ask where the sex is in the sex tape, because having watched this so many times, the Baikal sex tape, this is a joke that I'm beginning with. I don't understand just to frame this, I don't understand where the sex is at all, you know, it's like you're watching some sort of hotel security camera just catching ankles in some room. But in any case, that's just a joking beginning.
Well, that is actually true. It was either a hotel room or this is my interpretation, or an apartment that is rented by the party in Istanbul, so that the Ankara MPs, when they were to visit Istanbul, could stay there. So it's not a house. So it's either a hotel room or an apartment. There's been a secret tape. So this is not this is not like an opposition politician that's been caught on the streets. There's a political conspiracy behind this tape, and it's been 2 years. We have not even the slightest detail. There's, the chairman of the main opposition party loses his position. For all we know, maybe this tape is 2 years old, and for 2 years he's been blackmailed. So for the government to not take action, to not investigate, is, at least for me as a Turkish voter, repulsive.
No, I definitely think there's probably more to it. I was mostly beginning with a joke. Just I think there's something telling that the sex scandal that brings down the head of the most powerful opposition party in Turkey is about the least sexy tape imaginable. But in any event, that's just a joke. What I wanted to ask, I have one sort of general explanatory question, I guess you might say, and then one topic for consideration. So. I'm thinking in much of what you're presenting of the work of Cihan Tuğal, Passive Revolution, which of course is a somewhat different focus, more sociological and ethnographic. But he argues in Passive Revolution that the increasing hegemony, adopting Gramscian concepts, that the AKP has achieved in Turkey is a result of their ability to synthesize a relatively flexible, relatively moderate Islamist identity politics with a neoliberal model of citizenship. So, namely that neoliberalism in Turkey has been, in some sense, ushered in, that the AKP is the handmaiden of neoliberalism, and that ironically, however much the CHP or anyone else might think of themselves as advocating the small man or the small citizen, it's in fact these poor in districts like Sultanbeyli, which is in fact where he does his research, who have, on the one hand, most eviscerated by neoliberal reforms, but on the other hand, have really come to view the AKP as the only possible political option. So I guess the general question is, has the CHP in some sense fallen off the boat of neoliberalization in Turkey? And of course you can talk about EU skepticism here, but that's a sort of a general question that I think might, I know you're focusing on the election itself, so you're not dealing with that broader set, but I think it's worth considering. Secondly, we didn't talk about the MHP at all, and so of course the opposition in Turkey is not merely the CHP and the MHP, they don't win any of the il of the provinces, but Devlet Bahçeli et al. Still, you could argue.
They got one.
They got one. Was Tunceli? I thought it was just.
No, it's Iğdır. The province right by
there you go. What is that, Kayseri?
No, Iğdır.
Iğdır.
Mostly Azeri voters who have been probably unhappy about AKP's change of Turkish foreign policy vis-à-vis Armenia and Azerbaijan.
In any event, I just wondered what role the CHP clearly has to respond to the increasing hegemony of the AKP, but in some ways you might argue that at least part of their base has also been eroded by the increasing prominence of the MHP and that sort of right-wing nationalist movement as well. So I'm wondering how that fits into your analysis.
I'll do the MHP, you can do the CHP.
You want to start or shall I?
I'll go with the MHP. I mean, with the MHP is interesting. I mean, we haven't looked at this, but in relation to the scandals, I mean, they came up roughly, approximately the same time. And what is interesting to note about that, I mean, if you believe, if there's a conspiracy behind this, or the fact that it hasn't been investigated simply because the main opposition party's leader was targeted, as well as the hierarchy of the Nationalist Action Party, the far right. I mean, if you believe in the conspiracy, and I think there's a credibility to it because it's very opportune, the circumstances are very relevant. It's an upcoming election, and if the MHP, if the Nationalist Action Party was severely, if it were to have been discredited enough as a result of 10 sex scandals for its hierarchy that was standing for election, and if it achieved below the 10% threshold which is required for parliamentary entry by a political party, this would have put the incumbent party not at 327 MPs, because if the MHP didn't come in to Parliament, this would have put them above the 367 mark, the 2/3 barrier, which would have meant that they would not need to be negotiating with opposition parties for the passage or the promulgation of the new constitution. So it's highly significant. But yes, I mean, the MHP is a beast unto its own in terms of study, and that's my next project, because a good colleague of mine saying, stop with the JHP, you know, this is a dead project, let's just go study something else, but there we go.
This is actually an excellent question, and thanks a lot for raising it, because it will, you know, as we answer your question, you know, raise some of the points that we couldn't put in our presentation that maybe we are, you know, sort of discussing in our paper or in future papers, and that is the neoliberalism and the sort of socioeconomic changes that occurred within the Turkish context going back to the 1980s, because this is a story that will begin with the 24th of January 1980 economic decisions that began to liberalize Turkish economy, limited the role of the state under Özal during the 1980s, which then propelled the rise of sort of a set of conservative, with these more pious, more traditional businessmen that are located in Halkart Anatolia, that are now exploiting the loopholes of the Turkish economic system, you know, low tax rates, you know, weak unions, sort of a corrupt legal system, to basically produce goods for cheap and export them abroad. And with the rise of these people, of course, the Islamist Party itself has changed its ideology, because if you were to look at the previous Islamist parties, they've been very much along sort of third world, nationalist / reactionary to capitalism ideology, whereas with the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, this changed, and I think you have an excellent point there. To me, the key question that I'm sort of grappling with in my own dissertation, which compares Turkish politics with Latin American politics, is that in Latin America the same process have occurred, but the reaction to neoliberalism, which actually failed, whereas in Turkey I think it succeeded to a certain extent, produced populist leftist administrations. Whereas in Middle East, not just in Turkey, but in Middle East, the reaction to neoliberalism plus the benefits of neoliberalism have been reaped by Islamist movements rather than the populist movements. They are the Turkish populists with an ideology that is Islamist, but in terms of the organization structure, it resembles in some ways the populist movements that you could see in Latin America. So the big question to ask is why, in Middle East, not just in Turkey, the populists always come from the Islamist background, whereas in Latin America, another region that have gone through very similar socioeconomic changes over the last 70 years. You know, they had state-led economies in the 30s, 40s, 50s. These economies went into crisis in the 60s, 70s, and then came the neoliberal sort of era, supported by US, IMF, World Bank. So I think, you know, this is an overall question, this is like an overall point, but one argument that I could make vis-a-vis CHP is that the neoliberal economic structuring weakened the labor unions, weakened the civil servants, which were historically the base of CHP. You know, if you were working for the state in the 60s, 70s, you were a CHP supporter. I mean, generally speaking. Not all of them, of course. Labor unions, they have cooperated with CHP in the past. Now, what happens if your base is constantly weakened because of economic crises and economic restructuring? So it makes it very difficult for you to handle, so this is really a structural problem. You're going back to whether it's agency or structure. But one last argument I could make is that it's not just CHP, but none of the other parties, maybe with the exception of MHP, could stand against the tide of AKP. So, you know, we could actually turn the tables and say CHP has survived the rising tide of political Islam and is now trying to sort of turn back the tide. Now, we don't know whether they would succeed, but, you know, relatively speaking, they've also had some success as opposed to other center-right parties who have been completely wiped. In Turkey, no center-right parties left, and it is because of that that the Islamists could win elections.
You talk of CHP as if it was a victim almost. saying that it survived the Islamists rising, and it's still trying to adapt, even though it doesn't have the necessary political tools and stuff. And I think that many Turks would disagree with that portrayal, given that CHP had almost a century to adapt itself to Turkey and the changes within. So this is the comment part of my question. I get the question part is, what makes you think that CHP will ever get rid of all that baggage and adapt to new Turkey and win the waters over?
To sort of, I mean, this is why we wanted to put this slide in the beginning of our presentation, because CHP has actually evolved with the Turkish economy, with the Turkish society. I mean, when we talk about the left of center movement, we're not focusing on it in our presentation. But under the Ecevit years, CHP has won 2 elections, came to power. So when you say that it had 100 years and somehow CHP hasn't changed, this is, historically speaking, not true.
No, it has changed, but it hasn't been able to. It didn't adapt to the current situation in Turkey.
Well, then we shouldn't use the word 100 years. We should say maybe the post-1990s CHP hasn't adapted, and that's why this is our sort of opening puzzle. How come this party, which has changed so much, and it has actually had a sort of an adaptable ideology up until late 1980s, couldn't keep up with the changes? And I think this goes back to the fact that the Islamists are a different.
Well, thank you, Professor. Thank you for the presentation. According to the latest reports prepared by Turkish NGOs or the European NGOs, when they consider the last 2 elections in Turkey, they say that there has been a rise of swinging votes. It says 10 or 15% or maybe 20% of the voters voted for AKP government, seeing that they do not have any alternative. That may be due to boycott or the other dynamics playing in Turkish politics. Bearing in mind that the current changes in the CHP or CHP, what do you think that the CHP will the CHP be able to attract that 15 or 20% of swinging voters to its share? Will that be able to attract this amount of people? And you said that there have been some radical changes, but in terms of the major political agenda in Turkey, CHP cannot represent some kind of an alternative scenario to Syrian issue, to Kurdish issue, to PKK issue. They cannot bring about some kind of a new agenda, new approach. What's your evaluation about that?
Well, one of the biggest problems that we touched upon, but this, we need to dive further into it or explain further into it. It depends who is swinging the tail. Whether it's the tail swinging the body, or whether, this sort of that sort of analogy. But one of the problems is, let's say Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu was, able to implement the full force of his convictions, which is to take a very liberal view on, let's say, very protracted issues such as the headscarf, or let's say, when they said we're going to give fresh credit to the government over the Kurdish issue, if he was really, to go back, to sort of implement the full force of his convictions, then this could be very problematic for the party because he's going to get challenged. There are numerous factions within the party who will not negotiate on the Kurdish issue or do not want to negotiate on an affable solution to the Kurdish issue. They're very hardline. There are also factions which oppose headscarf reform or think that this should be allowed in the public sphere, quote unquote. And this goes back to the CHP's, this does have roots in the party's history. This is very hard for the party en masse because this is a party of conventions. This is a party that has had factional strife built into its very core. So the answer to that question, to your question, is I don't know. But the one thing that should be talked about is, we've forgotten about this because this is not my generation. I wasn't born then. I wasn't around then. And a lot of Turkish voters, maybe our parents' generations would. The Ecevit administration's beginning in 1972, after he toppled the veteran İsmet İnönü, all the way up until the 1980 coup, in that 8 years, were built upon radical, unprecedented changes in the party's ideology, in the way that they looked at the socio-economic and the socio-political organization of the state. What I mean by radicals, if you look at Ecevit's books, pamphlets, and speeches, he was the first one to cry out. He cried out on podiums, saying, "Look, we have Kemalism, but this is not enough. We have not been a listening party for a very long time. Radical changes need to be implemented." He did not want to associate the party with radical Che Guevarian leftism or socialism or Stalinist types of movements, but the party, late 60s, radically altered its economic, social, and political base to an unprecedented degree. So what I'm saying is the party capable of doing it? Absolutely, they've done it. They've done it previously. But the agency factor, coupled together with structural resistance factors, has really dampened the credible and credible ability of the party to change and adapt in the 90s and the post-90 era. But sufficient, strong, charismatic leadership has enabled the CHP to change in past, and I suspect it may be true in the future. But this is a starting point.
Sort of, just very briefly, building up on what Sinan has said, the left of the center movement that has sort of propelled CHP into power in the 1970s. There was a sociological base behind it. I mean, this is 1960s, industrialization taking off in Turkey, the labor unions becoming stronger, more sort of university students, creating new movements, and all of that force went into CHP through Ecevit. Had it not been for Ecevit, probably some of these forces would have joined other parties, maybe even more leftist, more radical parties, and CHP would not have benefited. So there's, leadership is very important, but there's that structure, that push for it. Now, CHP doesn't have that force behind it. So Kılıçdaroğlu has probably the most difficult task a leader could have in front of him, which is first create a sociology on which he can come to power. Well, how do you create new labor unions? How do you create a sort of a new political base? It's very difficult. The only way that I could see, because your question was sort of, I think, also looking for an alternative strategy, would be something that we were going to touch in our presentation but couldn't, and that is, in a group that is now being sidelined from the new liberal economic project of AKP, should be up for grabs. It will be very difficult for CHP in the foreseeable future, 10, 15 years, to win an election in Kayseri or Sivas or whatnot. But there are now growing sort of popular movements that are becoming increasingly critical of AKP. For instance, the anti-HES movements, the hydroelectric power stations that the government is pushing to build in the forest-rich areas of Turkey, mostly in Black Sea, which traditionally votes for center-right parties. Now, if CHP or certain groups from CHP could join those demonstrations, could walk with the people, then, who knows, in 5 years' time, maybe those people will begin to vote for CHP. Or, for instance, the urban poor that is being gradually excluded from the growing economic pie, living in the urban areas. Or the anti-gentrification movement. In Istanbul, as the property prices go up, the Islamists have realized that they could reap financial benefits by basically kicking out people from the slum areas, converting those areas into large apartment complexes and then selling them, or for profits. Now, of course, these people are also voters. And they could vote for CHP if CHP could give them an institutional sort of voice. And in the 2009 elections, we don't touch upon it in our paper, in 2009 elections, CHP has actually won in some, unlike the districts in Istanbul. And our sort of guess is that it has to do with the anti-gentrification sort of movements, because, 10 to 15% might be up for grabs, but not anything beyond that, at least in the foreseeable future. It's like, just, think of Mayor Daley of Chicago. How do you defeat him? He won elections and his son for almost 50 years. How do you defeat Mayor Daley, who has a political machine in place, a very strong organizational base, and could tell the districts that did not vote for him look, if you don't vote for me, there will not be any snow machines coming up to open up the roads. This is exactly what AKP is doing in Turkey right now. How do you defeat Mayor Daley? If you have an answer for that, CHP has the answer.
Okay, I think we are coming up to our deadline, and if you want to ask us any questions afterwards, we'd appreciate that, but I think we have to vacate the room rather sooner rather than later. But thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure having you.
Ne güzel. Ha? Oh, bakalım daha iyi.